The woman staggered through the scorching heat of the Wyoming afternoon, her worn boots dragging across the dusty earth as her vision blurred at the edges, and she knew with absolute certainty that she could not take another step forward before her legs finally gave out beneath her. Sarah Olsen had been walking for 3 days straight with nothing but a half-empty canteen and the clothes on her back. The summer of 1883 had brought with it a merciless sun that beat down on the Wyoming prairie without mercy, and her body had finally reached its limit. She had left Cheyenne with a traveling party heading west toward Winnetka, but when the wagon master had tried to force himself on her during the second night, she had fled into the darkness with nothing but her horse. That horse had stepped into a gopher hole 2 days ago, breaking its leg, and she had been forced to put the poor creature out of its misery with a rock since she had no gun. Since then, she had been walking, hoping to find some sign of civilization before her body gave out entirely. The ranch house shimmered in the distance like a mirage, and Sarah tried to call out, but her throat was too dry to produce more than a rasping whisper. The wooden fence posts seemed to stretch on forever, marking the boundary of someone's property, and she stumbled toward them with the last reserves of her strength. Her fingers brushed against the rough wood, and then her knees buckled, and the world went dark as she collapsed face first into the dirt just inside the property line. Thomas Nolan had been mending a section of fence on the western edge of his ranch when he spotted the figure stumbling across his land. At first he thought it might be a drunk cowhand from one of the neighboring spreads, but as he urged his horse closer, he realized it was a woman, and she was in serious trouble. By the time he reached her, she had collapsed completely, her body lying motionless in the dirt. He dismounted quickly, his boots hitting the ground hard as he rushed to her side. Thomas knelt beside her, gently turning her over to check if she was still breathing. Her face was burned red from the sun, her lips cracked and bleeding, and her clothes were covered in dust and sweat. But her chest was still rising and falling, shallow and weak, but steady enough to give him hope. "Madam, can you hear me?" he asked, knowing she probably could not respond. He lifted her carefully, surprised at how light she felt in his arms, and carried her to his horse. Getting both of them mounted was a challenge, but Thomas had been working this ranch for 5 years and had learned to handle difficult situations. He settled her in front of him, keeping one arm wrapped securely around her waist while he guided the horse with the other hand. The ride back to his ranch house took 20 minutes, and during that entire time, Thomas could feel the heat radiating from her body. She was burning up with fever, likely from sun exposure and dehydration, and he knew he had to act fast if he wanted to save her life. His ranch was modest but well-maintained, a sturdy 2-story house with a barn, a small stable, and a chicken coop out back. He had built most of it himself after buying the land with money he had saved from years of cattle drives. Thomas carried the unconscious woman into his house, kicking the door open and heading straight for his bedroom. He laid her down on his bed, then rushed to the kitchen to pump water into a basin. He grabbed several clean cloths from the cupboard and hurried back to her side. First, he needed to cool her down. Thomas dipped one of the cloths into the water and began gently wiping her face, washing away the layers of dust and grime. Her eyes moved beneath her closed lids, but she did not wake. He continued to work methodically, wiping down her neck and arms, trying to bring her body temperature down. Then he carefully lifted her head and dribbled a small amount of water between her cracked lips. "Come on now, you need to drink," he murmured, though he knew she could not hear him. Most of the water ran down her chin, but some of it seemed to go down her throat, and he took that as a good sign. Thomas worked through the evening, changing the cool cloths on her forehead every few minutes, giving her tiny sips of water whenever he thought she could swallow. He had dealt with sick cattle before, had even helped nurse an injured ranch hand back to health once, but this felt different. This woman had literally collapsed on his property, and he felt a deep responsibility to make sure she survived. As the sun set and darkness fell over the ranch, Thomas lit several oil lamps around the room so he could keep a close watch on her. Her fever seemed to be coming down slightly, and her breathing had become a bit stronger. He allowed himself a moment of cautious optimism as he sat in the chair beside his bed, watching the rise and fall of her chest. Around midnight, she began to stir. Her head turned from side to side, and she made a small sound of distress. Thomas immediately stood and moved to her side, placing a gentle hand on her shoulder. "Easy now, you are safe," he said softly. "You are at my ranch. You collapsed on my property and I brought you inside." Her eyes fluttered open, unfocused and confused. She tried to speak, but only a hoarse croak came out. Thomas quickly reached for the cup of water he had been keeping at her bedside. "Here, drink this slowly," he instructed, carefully lifting her head and bringing the cup to her lips. This time she was conscious enough to drink properly, and she gulped down the water desperately. "Slow, slow," Thomas cautioned, pulling the cup back slightly. "Too much too fast and you will make yourself sick." She obeyed, taking smaller sips until the cup was empty. When he lowered her head back to the pillow, her eyes had cleared somewhat, and she looked at him with a mixture of gratitude and wariness. "Who are you?" she managed to whisper, her voice still rough. "Thomas Nolan. This is my ranch about 10 miles west of Winnetka. What is your name?" "Sarah." "Sarah Olsen," she replied, then winced as if speaking caused her pain. "How long have I been here?" "I found you late this afternoon. It is past midnight now," Thomas explained, settling back into his chair. "You were in pretty bad shape, still are, truth be told. What happened to you?" Sarah closed her eyes, and for a moment Thomas thought she had fallen back asleep. But then she spoke again, her words coming slowly. "I was traveling with a wagon train from Cheyenne. The wagon master, he tried to force himself on me. I ran. My horse broke its leg and I had to put it down. I have been walking for days." Anger flared in Thomas's chest at her words. He had known men like that wagon master, men who thought they could take whatever they wanted from women who had no one to protect them. "You are safe here," he assured her firmly. "No one will hurt you on my land." "You have my word on that." Sarah's eyes opened again, and she studied his face for a long moment. Thomas was 26 years old, with dark brown hair that he kept short and a clean-shaven face that showed the tan lines from years of working outdoors. His blue eyes were direct and honest, and something in his expression must have reassured her because she nodded slightly. "Thank you," she whispered, and then her eyes drifted closed again as exhaustion pulled her back under. Thomas kept watch over her through the night, dozing occasionally in his chair but waking whenever she stirred. By the time dawn broke over the Wyoming prairie, painting the sky in shades of pink and gold, Sarah's fever had broken completely and her breathing was steady and strong. He left her sleeping and went outside to tend to his animals. The chickens needed feeding, the horse needed water, and he had a milk cow that would be unhappy if he did not attend to her soon. Thomas moved through his morning chores with practiced efficiency, but his mind kept drifting back to the woman sleeping in his bed. He had given up his room for her and would sleep on the couch for as long as necessary, though he hoped she would recover quickly. When he returned to the house with fresh eggs and a pail of milk, he found Sarah awake and attempting to sit up. She looked much better in the morning light, though still weak and obviously in need of rest. "You should stay lying down," Thomas advised, setting his supplies on the kitchen table and washing his hands in the basin. "Your body has been through a lot." "I have already imposed on you enough," Sarah protested, though her voice was still raspy. I should not be taking your bed." "Where exactly do you plan to go?" Thomas asked practically, moving to the bedroom doorway. "You can barely sit up, let alone walk. Besides, you collapsed on my property, which makes you my responsibility until you are well enough to take care of yourself." Sarah looked like she wanted to argue, but her body betrayed her by swaying dangerously even while sitting. Thomas quickly crossed the room and steadied her, easing her back down onto the pillows. "Rest," he ordered gently. "I am going to make some breakfast, and you are going to eat something, and then you are going to sleep some more. We can talk about what happens next when you are strong enough to have that conversation." He could see the stubborn set to her jaw, but she was too weak to fight him on it. "I do not have any money to pay you," she admitted quietly, and he could hear the shame in her voice. "I did not ask you for any," Thomas replied. "Now stop worrying and let me take care of you. That is what decent people do for each other out here. We help when help is needed." He left the room before she could protest further and busied himself in the kitchen. Thomas was a capable cook, having lived alone for the past 5 years. He made a simple breakfast of scrambled eggs, bacon, and biscuits left over from the day before. He brought a plate to Sarah along with another cup of water and a cup of weak tea. Sarah ate slowly, clearly struggling with her appetite, but Thomas was pleased to see her finish about half the food on her plate. When she was done, he took the dishes away and left her to rest, heading back outside to continue his work. The next few days fell into a steady rhythm. Thomas would wake at dawn, tend to his animals and property, then check on Sarah and bring her breakfast. She slept most of the first few days, her body recovering from the ordeal it had been through. By the 4th day, she was strong enough to sit up for longer periods and even insisted on moving to the couch so Thomas could have his bed back. "I have been sleeping on this couch just fine," Thomas argued, but Sarah was adamant. "You have done enough for me already. I will not take your bed anymore," she said firmly, and there was enough strength in her voice now that Thomas knew she would not back down. They compromised by Thomas carrying her to the couch, where she spent her days wrapped in a quilt he had pulled from the chest in his room. As she grew stronger, they began to talk more, and Thomas found himself looking forward to the conversations they shared during meals. Sarah told him about her life in Ohio, where she had been born 22 years ago. Her parents had died of influenza when she was 18, leaving her with no family and few options. She had worked as a seamstress for a few years, but when the factory owner's son had become too aggressive in his unwanted attentions, she had decided to head west in search of a fresh start. "I had heard there were opportunities out here for women willing to work hard," she explained one evening as they sat together in the main room of his house. "I thought maybe I could find work as a cook or a housekeeper at one of the ranches or in town. I had saved enough money for the wagon train and a little extra to get me started once I arrived. But when I ran from that wagon master, I left everything behind except the clothes on my back." Thomas listened with a frown, stirring the stew he had made for dinner. "Did anyone else in the wagon train try to help you?" Sarah shook her head, her expression bitter. "No one wants to make trouble with the wagon master. He controls whether they eat, where they camp, how fast they travel." The other women gave me sympathetic looks, but no one said a word when he started cornering me. I knew if I stayed, it was only a matter of time before he forced the issue. "You did the right thing getting away from him," Thomas said firmly. "A man like that does not deserve to be in charge of anything." Over the next week, Sarah continued to regain her strength. She began insisting on helping around the house, starting with small tasks like folding laundry and preparing vegetables for meals. Thomas protested at first, but he could see that she needed to feel useful, so he relented. He found himself enjoying her company more than he wanted to admit. The ranch had been a lonely place for the past 5 years. Thomas had bought the land and built his home with the dream of eventually having a family, but women were scarce in this part of Wyoming, and the few he had courted had not been interested in the hard work and isolation that came with ranch life. He had resigned himself to bachelorhood, focusing all his energy on building up his cattle herd and improving his property. But now, with Sarah here, the house felt different. It felt like a home rather than just a place to sleep between work. He liked hearing her humming while she worked, liked the way she arranged wildflowers in a jar on the kitchen table, liked the sound of her voice as she told him stories about her childhood in Ohio. Sarah seemed to be settling in as well, though Thomas noticed she was careful never to ask for anything and always tried to contribute more than she took. She had begun doing most of the cooking, and he had to admit her meals were better than his had ever been. She also cleaned the house from top to bottom, organized his chaotic collection of tools and supplies, and even mended several of his shirts that had been missing buttons or sporting small tears. One afternoon, about 3 weeks after Sarah had arrived, Thomas came in from checking on his cattle to find her standing in the kitchen with flour on her nose and an embarrassed expression on her face. "I was trying to make bread," she explained, gesturing at the disaster on the table. "But I think I used too much water, and now it is more like paste than dough." Thomas could not help but laugh at the sight. "I usually buy bread in town when I go to Winnetka. I never got the hang of making it myself." "Neither have I, apparently," Sarah said with a rueful smile. "My mother tried to teach me, but I was never very good at it. I can cook almost anything else, but bread has always defeated me." "Then we will keep buying it in town," Thomas said, moving to the basin to wash his hands. "I need to go into Winnetka tomorrow anyway to pick up some supplies. Maybe we could get you some things too. Some proper clothes, shoes that actually fit, whatever else you need." Sarah's expression shifted, becoming guarded. "Thomas, I told you I do not have any money. I cannot pay you back." "I know that," he said quietly, drying his hands on a towel. "But you cannot keep wearing the same dress every day. It is falling apart and winter will be here before we know it. You will need warmer clothes." "I should find work," Sarah said, her voice taking on a stubborn edge. "I have been here for 3 weeks, eating your food, sleeping under your roof. I need to start supporting myself." Thomas turned to face her fully. "Where are you planning to find this work? In Winnetka, I suppose. You said it is only 10 miles away. Surely someone in town needs a cook or a housekeeper." "Maybe," Thomas acknowledged. "But most of the ranch owners already have someone, and the few businesses in town are family-run. There might not be anything available." "Then I will keep looking until I find something," Sarah insisted. "I cannot stay here indefinitely, living off your charity." "It is not charity," Thomas said, and he was surprised by the intensity in his own voice. "You help around here plenty. The house has never been this clean, and I have been eating better than I have in years. If anything, I should be paying you for the work you are already doing." Sarah stared at him, her green eyes searching his face. "What are you saying?" Thomas had not planned to have this conversation yet, but now that they were having it, he found himself plunging forward. "I am saying that if you want to stay here, you can. Not as charity, but as a proper arrangement. You keep doing what you have been doing, helping with the house and the cooking, and I will provide room and board and pay you a fair wage on top of that." "You want to hire me as your housekeeper," Sarah said slowly, and he could not quite read the expression on her face. "Yes," Thomas confirmed, then hesitated. "Unless you would rather look for something else in town, I do not want you to feel trapped here." Sarah was quiet for a long moment, and Thomas could see her thinking through the offer. Finally, she spoke. "If I stay, there needs to be clear boundaries. I will not be in a situation where a man thinks he can take liberties just because I am dependent on him for shelter." Thomas felt his face heat with embarrassment and anger, though the anger was not directed at her. "I would never," he said firmly. "Sarah, I am not that wagon master. I am not going to force myself on you or expect anything from you beyond the work we agree on. You would have your own room, your own space. I give you my word." She studied him for another long moment, and then her shoulders relaxed slightly. "All right, I will stay and work as your housekeeper. But I want to be paid a proper wage, and I want to save that money so that if I ever decide to leave, I have the means to do so." "That is more than fair," Thomas agreed, feeling a surge of relief that surprised him with its intensity. "How does $15 a month sound, plus room and board?" Sarah's eyes widened. "That is more than fair. That is generous." "You are worth it," Thomas said simply, and he meant it. They shook hands on the agreement, and Thomas tried to ignore the way his skin tingled where their hands touched. He told himself that this was a practical arrangement, nothing more. Sarah needed a safe place to live and work, and he needed help around the ranch. The fact that he enjoyed her company and found himself thinking about her smile at odd moments throughout the day was irrelevant. The next day they rode into Winnetka together, with Sarah seated behind him on his horse. The town was small, consisting of a general store, a saloon, a church, a blacksmith, and about 20 houses scattered along a single main street. Thomas helped Sarah down from the horse and tied the reins to the hitching post outside the general store. Inside, the proprietor, a balding man named Mr. Henderson, greeted Thomas with a nod of recognition. "Thomas, good to see you. What can I help you with today?" "I need the usual supplies, plus some things for Miss Olsen here," Thomas said, gesturing to Sarah. "She is going to be working as my housekeeper, and she needs some proper clothes and shoes." Mr. Henderson's eyebrows rose slightly, and Thomas could see the curiosity in his expression. Small towns thrived on gossip, and Thomas knew that word would spread quickly about him hiring a young female housekeeper. But he did not care what people thought as long as Sarah was treated with respect. Sarah moved through the store, examining the ready-made dresses and practical work clothes. She selected 2 sturdy cotton dresses, a pair of boots, several pairs of stockings, a warm shawl, and a few other necessities. Thomas could see her checking the prices carefully, clearly trying to keep the cost down. When everything was tallied up, Thomas paid without comment, ignoring Sarah's guilty expression. He also bought extra fabric, needles, and thread so she could make additional clothes if she wanted. They loaded everything onto the horse, along with his usual supplies of flour, sugar, coffee, and other staples. As they were preparing to leave, a woman approached them on the street. She was in her 40s, with graying hair pulled back in a severe bun, and a dress that marked her as respectable but not wealthy. "Thomas Nolan," she said with a tight smile. "I heard you had taken in a woman. I wanted to see for myself." Thomas recognized her as Mrs. Patterson, the wife of one of the larger ranch owners in the area. She was known for her strong opinions and her tendency to involve herself in everyone else's business. "Mrs. Patterson," Thomas greeted her politely. "This is Miss Sarah Olsen. She is working as my housekeeper." Mrs. Patterson's eyes swept over Sarah with obvious skepticism. A young, unmarried woman living alone with a young, unmarried man. I am sure you understand how that might appear to decent folk. Thomas felt his jaw tighten with anger, but before he could respond, Sarah spoke up. "I assure you, madam, that everything is completely proper," she said with quiet dignity. "Mr. Nolan has been nothing but respectful and kind. He saved my life when I collapsed on his property, and he has offered me honest work." I have no family and no other means of supporting myself, so I am grateful for his generosity." Mrs. Patterson sniffed. "Nevertheless, appearances matter. If you were truly concerned about propriety, Mr. Nolan, you would arrange for a proper chaperone." "With all due respect, Mrs. Patterson, how I run my household is my own business," Thomas said firmly. "Miss Olsen is an employee, same as if I had hired a ranch hand. Now, if you will excuse us, we need to be getting back." He helped Sarah mount the horse and swung up behind her, leaving Mrs. Patterson standing on the street with a disapproving expression. As they rode out of town, Thomas could feel Sarah's shoulders tense. "I am sorry," she said quietly. "I did not mean to damage your reputation." "You did not damage anything," Thomas assured her. "Mrs. Patterson likes to make trouble where there is none. Most folks in town are good people who mind their own business. Do not worry about her." But as they rode back to the ranch, Thomas found himself troubled by Mrs. Patterson's words. Not because he thought there was anything improper about his arrangement with Sarah, but because it had made him realize how much he cared about Sarah's reputation. He did not want people in town thinking poorly of her. She deserved better than that. That night, after dinner, Thomas found himself watching Sarah as she washed the dishes. She had changed into one of her new dresses, a simple blue cotton that somehow made her green eyes look even brighter. Her blonde hair, which had been matted and dirty when he first found her, now shone in the lamplight, pulled back in a practical braid. She was beautiful, Thomas realized with a start. He had known she was pretty from the beginning, but somewhere over the past few weeks, she had become beautiful to him in a way that had nothing to do with just her physical appearance. It was the way she hummed while she worked, the way she always made sure his coffee was hot in the morning, the way she listened intently when he talked about his plans for the ranch. It was everything about her, and he was falling in love with her. The realization hit him like a physical blow. This was not supposed to happen. Sarah was his employee, someone who depended on him for shelter and wages. The last thing he wanted was to make her uncomfortable or to be like that wagon master who had driven her away from the wagon train. He would have to be careful to keep his feelings hidden, at least until he could figure out if she might possibly feel the same way. The summer weeks passed into early fall, and the ranch settled into a comfortable routine. Sarah had fully recovered her strength and worked tirelessly to improve the household. She planted a vegetable garden near the house, preserving what they could not eat fresh for the winter months ahead. She made curtains for the windows, cleaned years of accumulated dust from every corner, and even convinced Thomas to build a proper henhouse so the chickens would lay better. Thomas found himself looking for excuses to spend time near the house rather than out on the range. He would repair tools that did not really need repairing, organize the barn that was already organized, anything that would give him a chance to see Sarah and talk to her. She did not seem to mind his presence, and gradually they fell into longer and deeper conversations. One evening in late September, they sat together on the porch watching the sun set over the prairie. The air had turned cooler, promising an early winter, and Sarah had wrapped herself in the shawl Thomas had bought her in Winnetka. "I have been thinking," Sarah said quietly, breaking the comfortable silence between them, "about what Mrs. Patterson said in town." Thomas felt his stomach clench. "What about it?" "She was not entirely wrong," Sarah continued, her eyes fixed on the horizon. "We are both young and unmarried, and I am living in your house. People will talk." "Let them talk," Thomas said firmly. "We know the truth of the situation. That is what matters." Sarah turned to look at him, and there was something in her expression that he could not quite read. "Is it the truth, though?" "What do you mean?" Thomas asked, his heart starting to beat faster. I mean that this arrangement we have, it has become more than just employer and employee, has it not?" Sarah's voice was barely above a whisper. "The way you look at me sometimes, the way I find myself looking for you during the day, that is not just a working relationship." Thomas knew he should deny it, should maintain the boundaries they had established. But looking at Sarah in the fading light with her green eyes searching his face, he found he could not lie to her. "No," he admitted quietly. "It is not just a working relationship, not for me anyway. Sarah, I did not mean for this to happen. I know you came here looking for a safe place, and the last thing I want is to make you feel uncomfortable or pressured. If you want me to just be your employer, I can do that. I will do whatever you need me to do." Sarah was quiet for a long moment, and Thomas braced himself for rejection. But then she reached over and took his hand, her fingers intertwining with his. "I do not want you to just be my employer," she said softly. "Thomas, these past few months have been the happiest I have been in years, not just because I am safe, though that is part of it, but because of you. Because of the way you look at me like I matter, the way you listen when I talk, the way you make me laugh. I think I have been falling in love with you, and it terrifies me." "Why does it terrify you?" Thomas asked, squeezing her hand gently. "Because I do not want to be dependent on anyone," Sarah explained. "I do not want to be the kind of woman who needs a man to take care of her. I want to be strong enough to take care of myself." "You are strong enough," Thomas assured her. "Sarah, you survived being attacked by that wagon master, survived your horse dying and being stranded alone in the wilderness, survived 3 days of walking in the blazing sun. You are one of the strongest people I have ever met. Falling in love does not make you weak. It just means you are brave enough to let someone else in." Sarah's eyes filled with tears and she looked away. "What if you change? What if you become like him, thinking you can control me because I depend on you?" Thomas moved closer, gently turning her face back toward him. "I cannot promise I will always be perfect. I am human, and I will make mistakes, but I can promise you this. I will never try to control you or force you to do anything you do not want to do. I will always respect your right to make your own choices, even if that choice is to leave here and never see me again. And if you stay, it will be because you want to, not because you feel like you have no other option." "How can you be so sure?" Sarah whispered. "Because I have seen what men like that wagon master are like, and I would rather die than become one of them," Thomas said fiercely. "Sarah, I love you. I love your strength, your kindness, your determination. I love the way you turn this house into a home. I love everything about you. But I would rather have you as just my housekeeper and friend than have you stay with me out of fear or obligation." Sarah stared at him, and then slowly, tentatively, she leaned forward and kissed him. It was a gentle kiss, barely more than a brush of lips, but it sent electricity coursing through Thomas's entire body. When she pulled back, she was smiling through her tears. "I love you too," she whispered. "I have been trying not to, trying to convince myself that it was just gratitude or fear of being alone. But it is not. I love you, Thomas Nolan." Thomas kissed her again, more deeply this time, and felt her arms come up to wrap around his neck. When they finally broke apart, both of them were breathless and smiling. "So what do we do now?" Sarah asked, her eyes sparkling with happiness and uncertainty. "Now we court properly," Thomas said firmly. "I want to do this right. I want to marry you, Sarah, but only if and when you are ready. There is no rush. We can take all the time you need." Sarah laughed, a sound of pure joy. "I think we might have done things a bit out of order, what with me living in your house for months before we even courted. Then we will just have to make up for it," Thomas said with a grin. "I will court you properly, and when you are ready, I will ask you to marry me the right way." Over the next few months, Thomas kept his word. He courted Sarah with all the traditional gestures he could manage. He brought her wildflowers from the prairie, took her on picnics to the prettiest spots on his property, and sat with her on the porch every evening talking about their dreams for the future. Sarah blossomed under his attention, becoming more confident and open with her feelings. They kept their relationship quiet when they went into Winnetka, not wanting to stir up more gossip, but Thomas made sure to treat Sarah with obvious respect and care whenever they were in public. Gradually, the townspeople seemed to accept that Sarah was a permanent part of Thomas's household, and the talk died down. Winter came to Wyoming with its usual ferocity, bringing heavy snows and bitter cold. Thomas spent long days making sure his cattle were safe and had enough feed to survive the harsh conditions. Sarah kept the house warm and welcoming, with hot meals and a blazing fire waiting for him whenever he came in from the cold. On Christmas Eve, Thomas gave Sarah a gift he had been working on for weeks. It was a wooden box he had carved himself, decorated with intricate patterns of flowers and vines. Inside, he had placed a beautiful silver locket he had ordered from a jewelry maker in Cheyenne. Sarah's eyes filled with tears when she opened it. "Thomas, this is too much." "It is not enough," he corrected her, opening the locket to show her that he had placed a small photograph of himself inside. "I wanted you to have something to remind you that you are loved always." Sarah threw her arms around him, and they stood together in the warm kitchen, holding each other while snow fell softly outside the windows. Thomas had never been happier in his entire life. As winter gave way to spring of 1884, Thomas knew it was time. He had been planning this for weeks, and now everything was ready. On a warm April evening, he asked Sarah to walk with him to a spot on his property where a creek ran through a stand of cottonwood trees. The trees were just beginning to leaf out, their branches creating a canopy of pale green overhead. Sarah looked around in delight. "This is beautiful. I did not know this spot was here." "I found it when I was first surveying the property 5 years ago," Thomas explained. "I always thought it would be a good place to build a house someday, a real house for a family." Sarah turned to look at him, and he could see understanding dawning in her eyes. Thomas took a deep breath and got down on one knee, pulling a simple gold band from his pocket. "Sarah Olsen, you came into my life when I least expected it, and you have made every day since brighter and better than I could have imagined. You are strong, kind, beautiful, and brave, and I love you more than I have words to express. Will you marry me? Will you build a life with me here in this spot and make this ranch our home?" Sarah's face was radiant with joy as she nodded, tears streaming down her cheeks. "Yes," she said, her voice breaking with emotion. "Yes, I will marry you." Thomas slipped the ring onto her finger and stood, pulling her into his arms and kissing her deeply. When they finally broke apart, both of them were laughing and crying at the same time. "When?" Sarah asked breathlessly. "When do you want to get married?" "As soon as you want," Thomas replied. "Tomorrow, next week, next month. Whenever you are ready." Sarah thought for a moment, then smiled. "Let us get married in June. That will give us time to prepare, and it will be warm enough that we could have the ceremony here by this creek." Thomas agreed immediately, and they spent the rest of the evening planning their future. Sarah wanted a simple ceremony with just a few close friends from town. Thomas wanted to start building their new house right away, something bigger than his current cabin, with enough rooms for the children they both hoped to have someday. The next 2 months passed in a flurry of activity. Thomas hired some men from town to help him start construction on the new house, working long hours to get the frame up before the wedding. Sarah sewed her own wedding dress, a beautiful creation of white cotton with lace at the collar and cuffs. She also made new curtains and bedding for their new home, preparing everything with loving care. Word spread through Winnetka that Thomas and Sarah were getting married, and to Thomas's surprise and pleasure, most of the townspeople seemed genuinely happy for them. Even Mrs. Patterson, who had been so disapproving initially, softened her stance and offered to make the wedding cake. On a perfect June morning, with the sun shining and wildflowers blooming across the prairie, Sarah and Thomas were married beside the creek under the cottonwood trees. The minister from Winnetka performed the ceremony while about 20 friends and neighbors looked on. Sarah wore her white dress and carried a bouquet of prairie wildflowers. Thomas wore his best suit, which he had bought specifically for the occasion. When the minister pronounced them husband and wife, Thomas kissed Sarah with all the love and passion he had been holding back for months. Their guests cheered and applauded, and then everyone walked back to Thomas's cabin for a celebration that lasted well into the evening. That night, Thomas carried Sarah over the threshold of their current house, knowing it would be the last time she entered it as just his employee or his fiancée. She was his wife now, and he was her husband, and the joy of that reality overwhelmed him. Their wedding night was tender and sweet, both of them nervous and excited as they consummated their marriage. Thomas was gentle with Sarah, making sure she felt loved and cherished. When they finally fell asleep in each other's arms, both of them felt complete in a way they never had before. The new house was finished by late August, and they moved in together with great excitement. It was twice the size of Thomas's original cabin, with a large kitchen, a spacious main room, 3 bedrooms upstairs, and a wide porch that wrapped around 2 sides of the house. Thomas had built it with care, using the best materials he could afford, knowing that this would be the home where they would raise their family. Sarah filled the house with the touches that made it feel like a home. She hung the curtains she had made, arranged furniture they had bought in Cheyenne, and set up a proper dining room where they could host friends and family. Thomas built her a large vegetable garden beside the house and a chicken coop big enough for 24 hens. As fall arrived and they settled into their new home, Sarah began to notice changes in her body. She was tired more often, and certain smells that had never bothered her before now made her feel ill. When her monthly courses did not come, she began to suspect what was happening, and a visit to the doctor in Winnetka confirmed it. She was expecting their first child. Thomas was overjoyed when she told him, sweeping her into his arms and spinning her around until she laughed and begged him to stop. "We are going to be parents," he kept saying, his voice filled with wonder. "We are going to have a baby." Sarah glowed with happiness, though she worried about the changes pregnancy would bring. Thomas was attentive and supportive, taking over more of the household chores as her pregnancy progressed. He insisted she rest whenever she felt tired and consulted with the doctor regularly to make sure everything was going well. Winter came again, and Sarah spent the cold months knitting blankets and tiny clothes for their coming child. Thomas worked on building a cradle, carving it from beautiful oak and sanding it until it was smooth as silk. They talked for hours about names, about what kind of parents they wanted to be, about their hopes and dreams for their child. In March of 1885, on a snowy morning when the world seemed hushed and white, Sarah went into labor. Thomas rode through the storm to fetch the doctor and Mrs. Henderson, the general store owner's wife who served as the town midwife. The labor was long and difficult, lasting nearly 20 hours, and Thomas paced the floor downstairs, terrified for Sarah's safety. But when he finally heard the cry of a baby and was called upstairs, he found Sarah exhausted but radiant, holding a tiny bundle wrapped in one of her handmade blankets. "It is a boy," she said softly, her eyes shining with tears. "We have a son." Thomas approached carefully, almost afraid to touch something so small and precious. But Sarah placed the baby in his arms, and he looked down at the tiny face, the miniature fingers, the dark hair that seemed to come from his side of the family. "He is perfect," Thomas whispered, his own eyes filling with tears. "You did so well, Sarah. He is absolutely perfect." They named him Samuel Thomas Nolan after Sarah's father and Thomas himself. The baby was healthy and strong, with a good pair of lungs that he exercised frequently, especially at night. Thomas and Sarah took turns walking him when he cried, both of them bleary-eyed but happy as they adjusted to life as parents. The first year of Samuel's life passed in a blur of sleepless nights and precious moments. Thomas found himself amazed by how much he could love this tiny person, how his heart swelled every time Samuel smiled at him or wrapped his small hand around Thomas's finger. Sarah proved to be a natural mother, patient and loving even during the difficult times. As Samuel grew into a toddler, Sarah found herself expecting again. Their second child, a daughter they named Emma Grace, was born in the spring of 1887. She had Sarah's blonde hair and green eyes, and Thomas joked that he was going to have to beat the boys away with a stick when she got older. The ranch prospered as Thomas worked hard to build up his cattle herd and improve his land. Sarah managed the household and raised their children, though she also helped with the ranch work whenever she could. They hired a ranch hand, a young man named Charlie who lived in a small cabin Thomas built near the barn, and the extra help allowed Thomas to spend more time with his growing family. The years rolled by with the steady rhythm of ranch life. Samuel grew into a serious, thoughtful boy who loved following his father around and learning about cattle and horses. Emma was more adventurous, always getting into mischief and making her parents laugh with her antics. In 1889, they welcomed another son, Benjamin James, and in 1891, another daughter, Catherine Rose. The house that had seemed so spacious when Thomas first built, it now rang with the sounds of children playing, laughing, and occasionally fighting. Sarah somehow managed to keep order in the chaos, while Thomas worked to make sure the ranch could support their growing family. They were not rich, but they were comfortable, and more importantly, they were happy. On their 10th wedding anniversary in June of 1894, Thomas and Sarah stood together on the porch of their home, watching their 4 children play in the yard. Samuel was 11 now, tall and gangly, helping 7-year-old Emma build something with pieces of wood. Benjamin, at 5, was trying to catch a chicken, while 2-year-old Catherine toddled after him, giggling at his efforts. "Can you believe it has been 10 years?" Sarah asked, leaning against Thomas's shoulder. "Sometimes it feels like just yesterday that I found you collapsed in my field," Thomas replied, wrapping his arm around her waist. "Sometimes it feels like you have been here forever." "I have been thinking about that day a lot lately," Sarah admitted. "About how terrified I was when I ran from that wagon train, how I thought my life was over when my horse died. I was so sure I was going to die out there in the wilderness." "But you did not," Thomas said softly. "You survived. You found your way here." "I found my way to you," Sarah corrected, turning to look up at him. "Thomas, these 10 years have been the best of my life. Yes, it has been hard sometimes. Ranch life is not easy, and there have been times when I was exhausted and frustrated and wondered if we would make it through. But I would not trade a single moment of it, not one, because I have spent every day with you and we have built this beautiful life together." Thomas kissed her softly, not caring that their children might see. "I love you, Sarah, more now than I did 10 years ago, if that is even possible. You are my partner in every way, and I thank God every day that you stumbled onto my property." "Collapsed from exhaustion," Sarah corrected with a laugh. Let us be accurate about my dramatic entrance into your life." They stood together watching their children until Sarah called everyone in for dinner. The family gathered around the large table Thomas had built, everyone talking over each other as they shared stories from their day. Samuel proudly reported that he had fixed a broken fence post all by himself. Emma announced she had found a bird's nest with 3 eggs in it. Benjamin demonstrated his new skill of standing on one foot. Catherine just babbled happily, content to be the center of attention. After dinner, Thomas helped Sarah wash the dishes while the older children got the younger ones ready for bed. It was a routine they had developed over the years, these quiet moments together after the chaos of the day. "You know," Sarah said thoughtfully as she dried a plate, "I have been thinking we should expand the vegetable garden next spring, maybe add some berry bushes too. Emma has been asking if we could make jam." "That sounds good," Thomas agreed. "I have been thinking about buying some more land to the south. Old Mr. Patterson is looking to sell, and it would nearly double our range." "Can we afford it?" Sarah asked practically. "I think so," Thomas said. "The cattle sales have been good the past few years, and if we are careful, we should have enough. It would mean we could expand the herd, maybe hire another hand or two." They continued planning and dreaming together, the way they had done since the beginning. After the dishes were done and the children were all asleep, they sat together on the porch, watching the stars come out over the Wyoming prairie. "You ever regret it?" Thomas asked quietly. "Staying here instead of going on to find other opportunities?" "Never," Sarah said firmly. "This is exactly where I am supposed to be. This ranch, this life, you and our children. This is everything I ever wanted, even when I did not know I wanted it." The years continued to pass peacefully. Thomas bought the Patterson land in 1895, expanding their ranch significantly. Samuel grew into a young man who loved ranching as much as his father did, and it was clear he would take over the operation someday. Emma proved to be brilliant with numbers and began helping Sarah manage the ranch's accounts. Benjamin was gentler than his older brother, preferring to work with the horses rather than the cattle. Catherine was still young but showed signs of being as adventurous as her older sister. In 1896, a severe drought hit Wyoming, and many ranchers struggled to keep their herds alive. Thomas and Sarah worked tirelessly, hauling water from the creek to their cattle, rationing their own supplies to make sure the animals survived. It was a difficult year, and they lost some of their herd, but their careful management and hard work allowed them to weather the crisis better than many of their neighbors. When the drought finally broke in the spring of 1897, Thomas and Sarah stood together watching the rain fall, both of them crying with relief. "We made it," Sarah said, holding Thomas's hand tightly. "We survived." "We did more than survive," Thomas said. "We are still here, still strong. As long as we have each other, we can get through anything." More years passed, bringing both joys and sorrows. Charlie, their longtime ranch hand, got married and moved to his own place, but they hired 2 new hands to replace him. Sarah's vegetable garden flourished, and she began selling her produce and preserves in Winnetka. Emma showed an interest in teaching and began helping at the schoolhouse in town. Samuel started courting a sweet girl from a neighboring ranch. On their 20th wedding anniversary in 1904, Thomas surprised Sarah with a trip to Cheyenne. They left the children in Samuel's capable hands and spent 3 days in the city, staying in a hotel and eating in restaurants and shopping in stores that were far fancier than anything Winnetka had to offer. It was strange being away from the ranch, but wonderful to have time alone together. On their last night in Cheyenne, they had dinner at an elegant restaurant, and Thomas presented Sarah with a gift. It was a beautiful gold bracelet, engraved with the date they had met and the date they had married. "Thomas, this is too extravagant," Sarah protested, though he could see the pleasure in her eyes. "After 20 years, I think I am allowed to be extravagant," Thomas replied. "Sarah, you have given me everything. A home, a family, a life worth living. This bracelet is nothing compared to what you have given me." Sarah's eyes filled with tears. "We have given each other everything. I would have died in that field if you had not found me. You saved my life in every way a person can be saved." They returned to the ranch renewed and refreshed, ready to face whatever the future might bring. Samuel married his sweetheart in 1905 in a beautiful ceremony at the ranch. Emma started her own school in Winnetka in 1907, teaching children from all the surrounding ranches. Benjamin, quieter and more introspective than his siblings, became known as the best horse trainer in the county. Catherine grew into a spirited young woman who had her mother's beauty and her father's determination. In 1909, Sarah became a grandmother for the first time when Samuel and his wife had a daughter. Holding her tiny granddaughter in her arms, Sarah thought back to that day 26 years ago when she had collapsed from exhaustion on Thomas's property. She had been running from danger, alone and terrified, with no idea what the future might hold. Now she was surrounded by love and family, living in a beautiful home on a successful ranch, married to a man who had loved her faithfully for over 2 decades. She looked up to find Thomas watching her with their granddaughter, and the expression on his face was one of pure contentment. "What are you thinking about?" he asked softly. "I am thinking about how far we have come," Sarah replied. "About how that terrified young woman who collapsed in your field grew into this person who has a life and a family and a future. About how lucky I am that you found me that day." "I am the lucky one," Thomas corrected gently. "You walked into my life and made everything better. You still do, every single day." They stood together in their comfortable home, surrounded by the sounds of their family, and both of them felt the deep satisfaction that comes from a life well lived and love that has endured through everything. As the years continued forward into the second decade of the new century, Thomas and Sarah's ranch became something of a landmark in the area. The Nolan Ranch was known for its well-maintained property, its quality cattle, and the strong family that ran it. Thomas, now in his 50s, had handed over much of the day-to-day operations to Samuel, but he still loved being out on the range, still found satisfaction in the work he had been doing for nearly 30 years. Sarah, too, had found her life taking on a new rhythm. With Emma running her school, Benjamin managing the horse operation, and Catherine helping with the younger children in the family, Sarah had more time to pursue projects she had always wanted to try. She started a small business preserving and selling vegetables and jams, which became popular throughout the county. She also began writing down the stories of her life, wanting to leave a record for her grandchildren of where they had come from. In 1914, the family celebrated Thomas and Sarah's 30th wedding anniversary with a huge party at the ranch. Friends and neighbors came from miles around, and the celebration lasted all day and well into the night. There was dancing and music and more food than anyone could possibly eat. Thomas and Sarah renewed their vows under the cottonwood trees where they had first been married, with all 4 of their children and their growing number of grandchildren watching. 30 years ago, I married the woman who had collapsed from exhaustion on my property, Thomas said during the ceremony, his voice strong despite his age. I thought I was just helping someone in need, but what I really did was find my soulmate, my partner, my love. Sarah, you have made every day of these 30 years worth living. I love you more now than I thought possible to love anyone. Sarah, tears streaming down her face, responded with her own vows. 30 years ago, I was running for my life, terrified and alone. I thought I was at the end of my strength, the end of my hope. But I found you, Thomas, and you showed me that there was still good in the world, that there were still men who treated women with kindness and respect. You nursed me back to health, and in doing so, you healed my spirit as well as my body. I fell in love with you slowly and then all at once, and that love has sustained me through everything. I love you, Thomas Nolan, and I will love you for whatever time we have left together. The minister pronounced them husband and wife all over again, and they kissed to thunderous applause from their gathered family and friends. It was a perfect day, full of love and laughter, and the kind of joy that comes from celebrating a life well lived together. As the sun set on that celebration, Thomas and Sarah sat together on their porch, watching their children and grandchildren play in the yard. The ranch stretched out around them, the land they had worked together to build and maintain. The house they had created was full of memories, every room holding stories of their life together. "We did good, did we not?" Thomas asked, his arm around Sarah's shoulders. "We did very good," Sarah agreed, leaning into him. "Better than I ever dreamed possible." They sat in comfortable silence, watching the stars come out over the Wyoming prairie, just as they had done countless times over the past 3 decades. The land was the same land where Sarah had collapsed all those years ago, but it had been transformed by their work and love into something beautiful and lasting. The First World War brought challenges to the ranch as it did to all of America, but the Nolan family weathered those years together, supporting each other through the difficulties. Benjamin enlisted and served honorably, returning home safely in 1918 to great celebration. Emma's school continued to grow, educating a new generation of children. Samuel expanded the ranch's operations, proving himself to be as capable a rancher as his father had been. In 1920, Thomas and Sarah became great-grandparents when Samuel's daughter had her first child. Holding the tiny baby in her arms, Sarah marveled at the span of life, at how that exhausted woman who had collapsed in a field in 1883 had become the matriarch of this large, loving family. As they entered their 60s and then their 70s, Thomas and Sarah slowed down but never stopped being active parts of the ranch and their family. They took long walks together every evening, weather permitting, often ending up at the creek under the cottonwood trees where they had been married. They would sit together on a bench Thomas had built there, holding hands and talking about everything and nothing, the way they had always done. In the spring of 1929, Thomas fell ill with pneumonia. Sarah nursed him through it with the same dedication he had shown her when he first found her all those years ago. For weeks, she barely left his side, giving him medicine, changing his cool cloths, talking to him even when he was too weak to respond. Just as he had saved her life in 1883, she saved his in 1929, and when he finally recovered, both of them knew how precious their remaining time together was. "I am not ready to leave you yet," Thomas said weakly one evening as he recovered. "Good," Sarah replied firmly, holding his hand. "Because I am not ready to let you go. We still have more living to do, Thomas Nolan," and they did. Thomas recovered fully, and they continued their life together, now into their 7th decade of existence on Earth and their 5th decade of marriage. They celebrated their 50th wedding anniversary in 1934 with another large party at the ranch, this one attended by dozens of children, grandchildren, and great-grandchildren, along with friends from throughout Wyoming. 50 years, Thomas said in his speech that day, his voice still strong despite his age. 50 years since Sarah Olsen became Sarah Nolan. 50 years since we stood under those cottonwood trees and promised to love each other. It has been the greatest privilege of my life to keep that promise every single day for 50 years. Sarah, equally strong at 73, stood beside him. 56 years ago, I collapsed from exhaustion on this land. I thought my life was ending. Instead, it was beginning. Thomas found me, saved me, loved me, and gave me a life beyond anything I could have imagined. Our 50 years of marriage have been filled with joy and sorrow, triumph and struggle, but through it all, we have had each other. That has made all the difference. They danced together that day, moving slowly to music played by their grandchildren, surrounded by the evidence of their love made manifest in the dozens of descendants who carried their legacy forward. The ranch was now run primarily by Samuel and his children, but it still bore the mark of Thomas and Sarah's care and vision. As the Great Depression affected the country, the ranch faced economic challenges, but the family pulled together to survive, just as they always had. Thomas and Sarah's lessons about hard work, careful management, and supporting each other through difficult times served their descendants well. Into their 80s, Thomas and Sarah remained active parts of their family and community. They were the beloved patriarch and matriarch of the Nolan clan, and their advice and wisdom were sought on everything from ranching decisions to relationship problems. They had lived long enough to see the world change dramatically, from the wild frontier of their youth to the modern world of automobiles and electricity. But their love had remained constant through it all. On a warm summer evening in 1939, Thomas and Sarah sat together on their porch, watching yet another sunset over the Wyoming prairie. They were both in their 80s now, moving slowly but still sharp in mind and spirit. Thomas had held Sarah's hand every day for 56 years since she had first accepted his proposal, and he held it still as they watched the sky turn gold and pink and purple. "You remember the day I found you?" Thomas asked, though he knew she did. They had told the story hundreds of times to their children and grandchildren. "I remember thinking I was going to die," Sarah said softly. "I remember seeing your ranch house in the distance and trying to reach it. I remember the feeling of the ground coming up to meet me as I fell. And then I remember waking up and seeing your face and knowing somehow that I was going to be all right." "You were so stubborn," Thomas said with a laugh. "Even half dead from heat exhaustion, you were trying to argue with me about imposing on my hospitality." "I did not want to be a burden," Sarah defended herself. "I had spent my whole life trying to be independent. And yet you let me take care of you," Thomas pointed out. "Because I could see in your eyes that you were a good man," Sarah replied. "Because you never once made me feel like I owed you anything for your kindness. Because you treated me with respect and dignity, even when I was completely dependent on you." Thomas squeezed her hand gently. "Falling in love with you was the easiest thing I have ever done. Living up to your standards has been the work of a lifetime, but the most worthwhile work I have ever attempted." "You have exceeded any standards I might have had," Sarah assured him. "Thomas, you have been everything I needed and more than I deserved. These 56 years have been a gift." They sat together in the gathering darkness. Two people who had built a life and a legacy together, who had turned a chance encounter into a great love story. Around them, their ranch continued its operations, their family continued to grow, and their love continued to inspire everyone who knew them. Thomas and Sarah Nolan lived out their remaining years together in peace and contentment, surrounded by the family they had created and the land they had nurtured. They passed away within months of each other in the early 1940s, both having lived into their mid-80s, both having seen their family grow to include dozens of descendants who would carry on their legacy. They were buried together under the cottonwood trees by the creek, the place where they had been married all those years ago. Their headstone was simple but meaningful, bearing both their names and the dates of their birth and death, along with a single inscription that told their entire story. She collapsed from exhaustion on his property. He nursed her back to health. They fell in love and built a life together. The Nolan Ranch continued to thrive under the management of their descendants, a testament to the strong foundation Thomas and Sarah had built. Their children grew old with stories to tell about their remarkable parents. Their grandchildren and great-grandchildren grew up hearing the tale of how their family had begun, of the exhausted woman who stumbled onto a cowboy's land and found not just shelter, but love and home and family. And on quiet summer evenings, when the sun sets over the Wyoming prairie painting the sky in brilliant colors, you can almost imagine them still sitting on that porch together. Two souls who found each other against all odds and created something beautiful that would last for generations to come. Their love story became legend in Winnetka and the surrounding areas, a reminder that sometimes the most profound love stories begin with the simplest act of kindness. That sometimes falling down is really just the first step toward being lifted up. And that true love, once found, can weather any storm and create a legacy that never truly ends.